In today's episode, we hit the beaches at Okinawa as American forces begin a grinding 82-day campaign to capture the island from determined and dug-in Japanese defenders.
Welcome to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the Second World War from the Allied and Axis perspectives. I'm Jesse Alexander, a public historian specializing in the history of the two world wars.
And I am Matthias Strohn, German officer, professor of military studies, and author. Hi, Jesse. Here we are again. Another week, another podcast. This is Okinawa Part 2. So in the previous episode, as we always do, we set the scene. We talked a little bit about history going hundreds of years back, then looked at geography, terrain, the opposing forces, the strategic plan, the operational planning. And now, as I just said in the opening sentence, it's time to really get stuck in and have a look at the tactical fight that is happening here at Okinawa, this very, very ferocious, last huge big battle of World War II. So where do we start? What do you think?
Well, I think I'll do a whistle-stop tour of the planning, essentially, and a little bit maybe the geography, just as a refresher and a reminder. So basically, you have over 100,000 Japanese on this island. It is legally, but not really culturally, a part of the Japanese home islands, which adds a bit of a different approach, a bit of a different stakes with the civilian population, which is 400 and something thousand people. So that's an important characteristic to keep in mind. The island is not that far from Japan, so it's, from the American point of view, going to be a useful stepping stone if ever they have to invade Japan, which many people expect at this time in spring 1945. The island is long and thin on a north-south axis. It's over 100 kilometers long, but it's only something like 10 or 11 kilometers wide. The Japanese have about 100,000 plus men on it. The Americans organize a huge fleet of over 1,400 ships to support the invasion. They have nearly 200,000 men ready to land on Okinawa. The north of the island is very densely forested and very hilly, which is probably not going to be that easy to capture. The south of the island is very rocky and has caves and limestone ridges. Also not going to be easy when you have the Japanese making use of these, as they have on previous island campaigns. So basically, the Japanese plan is to allow the Americans to land, to not put full effort into defending the beaches. That's a lesson they've learned from previous battles like Peleliu, for example. And the American objective is to capture using the cover of naval firepower and air power to capture important airfields, to split the island in two, and to then reduce Japanese resistance to use the island as a base. That, I think, is a reasonable summary of what lets us hit the ground running on April 1st when the operation begins.
Absolutely perfect. And let's not forget, it's a long operation, isn't it? Over 80 days. So this is not a walk in the park. You might think, well, the war is nearly over, it's nearly done. No, far from it. So this really is a very, very ferocious fight that you see here on both sides, going on for a long, long time. And of course, it's a complex battle because it's amphibious. So you've got, of course, the land force involved, you've got the naval contingent, you've got air. So everything is here, which makes it a very complex battle, you might say. So we probably need to break this down a little bit. But perhaps let's start with the land component, because these are the guys who actually need to do most of the real fighting and fight their way through the Japanese defensive lines. And that, of course, also means that normally it's the land forces that take most of the casualties, and we can look at that at a later stage. So in order to facilitate the landings on the main island itself, it is quite a good idea to capture some of these islands that you can find just off the main islands. Relatively small, but still potentially important because you can use them for resupply, or at least you want to control them so the Japanese can't control them. And you might say the opening stage of the battle, which we normally say starts on the 1st of April with the landing on the main island, The opening stage happens a little bit earlier than that, and that's on the 26th of March. This is when the 77th Infantry Division, the US division, lands on the Kurama Islands. So these islands are, roughly speaking, 25 kilometers to the west of Okinawa. You've got some subsidiary landings there, and then there is a little bit of fighting going on. It takes the Americans 5 days to secure this island. And the casualties that you can see already give you an idea about how the fighting is going to be. Say the American casualties are reasonably light. So you're looking at, again, the figures are a bit different, debated, but normally just under 30 dead and about 80 wounded. Whereas the sources also tell us of around about 650 Japanese casualties. So again, you can see the casualty ratio is quite interesting, as we see it quite often in the Pacific theater of war. You then have some other incidents where some of these smaller islands, where the Japanese, for example, allegedly forced the civilians to kill themselves. About 390 of them have to kill themselves. So you can see all sorts of things happening in this shaping operation before the battle action happens. There's another one where you've got a amphibious recce reconnaissance battalion lands on Kaishishima. That's on the 31st of March. All part of this shaping. And this one's important because it's unopposed landing, and they can land a number of artillery pieces there, which they can use as an indirect fire support role when the landing actually happens. And then the main landing happens on the 1st of April. And the main landing is conducted by the 24th Corps and the 3rd Amphibious Corps on the Hagushi beaches and the western coast of Okinawa. I think on the last episode, Jesse, you talked about where the landing beaches are. So they're in the west. And so you also have another landing by the 2nd Marine Division. Basically, it's a demonstration of the Minatoga beaches on the southeastern coast to deceive the Japanese forces. The main landing comes in on the west coast. And it's interesting because, as we now say a number of times, the Japanese are not really thinking about putting up too much resistance against the landings. And they do have these two strongholds, you might say. The main defensive areas are in the south, but there's also stuff happening in the north, not least because of the terrain. So the 10th Army, as it's landed with these two corps, basically pushes through and quite quickly sweeps across the south central part of the island. They capture 2 air bases, which they can use, and that's basically within hours of the landing. So it's looking really, really good and really promising for the Americans. And as a consequence of that, the American General Buckner, he then decides to bring forward some of the plans and some of these ideas and the stages of the war plan. And that's he says, okay, we go immediately into phase 2, because that is the seizure of northern Okinawa. So these are the different stages. Land in the center, then once you've secured everything, from there you move into the north, and then you move into the south. They're speeding things up because things seem to be going quite well. And then already by the 7th of April, I think it's the 6th Marine Division, had then sealed off the peninsula, the Motubu Peninsula. And you can see that the Japanese are now more or less, well, encircled, you might perhaps say, if that's the right word here. They're cut off. And at the moment, it is actually looking quite good and quite promising for the Americans. It's now the fighting gets a bit heavier, and you can see you're now running into more of Japanese resistance. And you can see actually it's not a walk in the park, as you might say, perhaps they'd hoped after the very, very first phase of this operation.
I think, sometimes I try to imagine what the troops on the ground are thinking, given what I end up reading as in terms of, how you perceive what's happening. Obviously, the people with boots on the ground have a complementary at best, or very different, maybe at worst, experience and view and perspective compared to someone who's partway up the chain of command, compared to someone 80 years later, like me, a civilian, reading about it in a book that's written probably by another civilian about it. So one of the things that struck me was the experience of some of those Marines and soldiers who are landing, who might have, their last time in action was Peleliu or Tarawa, where the beaches are essentially kill zones and it's going to be awful. And imagine the relief if all of a sudden you land and not much is going on and you're not under fire on that exposed beach and you can get inland enough where you capture an objective or you can set up a position or you can take shelter behind a partial ridge while you take stock and wait for orders or whatever the case may be. It's a huge psychological difference. Of course, little do they know, that is the Japanese plan in order to inflict more pain on them later. And one of these veterans became very, very famous because he wrote a memoir later. Many of you probably know who I'm going to mention. His name's Eugene Sledge, right? So he becomes one of the, I guess his memoir is the basis of the Pacific television series, part of the Band of Brothers series. And he wrote when he landed on Okinawa, I mean, he's stressed, right? His last combat experience of landing on a beach was Peleliu, where all hell breaks loose immediately. And so he says it's eerie and it's a relief that we're not being pounded as soon as we get on the beaches. And of course, many others probably had similar thoughts to him. The Americans land 50,000 men initially. Of course, they have more that are going to be involved in the fighting, but they land 50,000 initially. And on those beaches, they only take 55 casualties. That's wild. 55 casualties. It's not comparable at all to what the Japanese tried to do in some of those earlier island hopping battles. And it makes me think. It just makes me think about what that experience is like, the unpredictability of danger, because it's still coming for them. They just at that moment don't know it, right? I don't know. Sometimes I think about these kind of more personal things.
And that's an extremely good point, because we look at, of course, what happens, and it's quite easy to say, oh, yeah, okay, they landed and nothing happened, and it was a walk in the park and brilliant, and say, what are you worried about? But of course, that does not take away exactly what you just said. So the night before you actually jump on that landing craft, you know that you're going to do something the next day, and you don't know what's going to happen. So everybody who tells you that he's not afraid at that particular stage is a complete liar, because you are worried sick. You're worried sick because you don't know. You just have got no idea. Will I live another day? Yes or no? What happens afterwards is, of course, another matter. But at that particular moment, that is really not a nice position to be in. You can go back all the way through history, every big war, all the way into antiquity. These accounts from people about sitting around the campfires, for example, and waiting for the battle to happen the next day. I mean, I haven't been in big, huge battles, but smaller engagements. And when you know the evening before you go out, you know you're going to go into an engagement the next day, trust me, you don't sleep a lot. That's just the way it is. And then, of course, what is it that you do then? Some people have said, well, braveness and being brave is not being afraid. It's overcoming your fear. And that's exactly what it is. And that's so basically the next morning you get up, you function, you go through the drills. That's what drills were invented for. Because drill basically stops you from worrying. You unhinge the brain and you just function like a machine. And that is exactly the idea behind that. And that's what you do. And once you swing into motion, you then will overcome it, or at least the fear, or at least you can function still with that fear. And that's the whole idea. And once the landing craft, well, the doors go down and you jump into the water, you think, what's going to happen now? That is not a nice situation. You just imagine the relief. As you then realize, you know what, the Japanese aren't here. Isn't that brilliant? Well, not there, but they're going to hit them later.
But in those woods and ridges in the distance, they
exactly.
are. No, there's no question. And this is why even what might seem from a historical point of view as a non-factor, a light engagement, a cakewalk, I mean, psychologically for the people involved, that can leave an impact as well, that extreme spike in, life or death type of stress, right? That can have an impact, that can certainly have an impact as well. In fact, we're on a tangent now, folks. Forgive us. This is what we do once in a while. I read another way of thinking about it in an interview with a Ukrainian soldier, a current Ukrainian soldier, and he also happens to be a historian, but he said, I learned when I need to fight my fear and resist it, and when I need to kind of work with it. And he put it as, go ahead shoulder to shoulder with it. Only he knows exactly what that meant, but I thought it was an interesting contrast to trying to work with the fear and accepting that it's there versus pushing it aside, resisting it. And that kind of makes me, I thought of that when you were mentioning the interplay between your training that allows you to kind of overcome it versus not being able to escape from it the night before, say, for example. So there are these kind of, these kind of very, very hard internal tensions that go on and that can be overcome sometimes, not, but sometimes in different ways.
And experience, of course, is another very important factor. So you look at these guys landing here in 1945, and also let's not forget most of these Japanese guys, because they would be worried as well. Just if you look at the situation in 1945, they're on the back foot anyway. They know the Americans are coming. They have all this firepower. This is not a nice situation to be in for them either. How do you overcome this? Again, it's this training bit, living with the fear, and how do you put this all together? Experience plays a massive role as well. It's simple things like when you hear an incoming round, whether it's a mortar round or artillery round, after a while your ear figures out whether that is actually a threat or not. So what happens when you hear the first few rounds, immediately everyone hits the deck. And I used to remember going on operations and I heard something coming out, just arrived, and I was on the floor immediately. Everyone was just looking at me, staring at me, laughing. So like in a bad film, so what are you doing? I said, well, there's incoming fire. No, that's 500 meters from here. Get up again. And okay. And then, of course, your ear needs to get used to it. But the good thing there was that no one was then getting cocky and saying, you're complete idiots. I know, you will learn, because there are lots of examples as well. People then getting cocky and then the guy not hitting the deck when you actually have to hit the deck. And that's not good. And this is where the experience comes in. And this, perhaps to a degree, that's why I mentioned this. This is where this living with the fear and be guided by your fear a little bit comes in as well, because the body and the mind adjusts. But that's a complete tangent now, isn't it? But there we are. But it's an important one, because quite often these things get overlooked. They're quite often, it's very easy to just talk about, as I said, the cold facts. And when I write military history, I quite often do cold facts. Also, when I analyze it for the army, which I sometimes call the cold eye of the staff officer. So you're basically you're removed from the actual the fighting, the bloodshed, all that kind of stuff, and you go take it one step back, and all you do is analyze the situation. That can be quite cold. And you talk about casualties, 50 people died. Well, okay, better than 60 or whatever it might have been. But when you then zoom in and think about what it actually means, it really changes the situation. And quite often we tend to overlook this, and that's not good, because war is, as some people say, it's 90% boredom and 10% horror, which sums it up quite nicely.
I think so too. Right.
End of
we'll
tangent.
Close off the tangent for now. End of tangent for now. We'll head back to Okinawa, where we have the Americans who have basically successfully landed and chopped the island in half and captured a couple of airfields against very light, surprisingly light, but planned Japanese resistance. Then things start to slow down from the American point of view. The Japanese start making use of their prepared positions, often, for example, on reverse slopes. So that basically means the backside of a hill or of a ridge or what have you, where anyone firing at you has to get their ammunition to go up and over the hill and hit you on the other side, which is very, very hard to do, especially if the gun firing that shell is floating on the ocean, which makes it quite a challenge. So the Japanese use that to protect themselves and continue resisting in the forested areas towards the north. As the Americans get towards more forested territory, that's perfect for ambushes, right? So the Japanese start throwing ambushes at the Americans as they advance. In the south, there are more of these prepared positions along these ridges that people who are familiar with the battle will probably know several of them. Tombstone Ridge, Kakuza Ridge, Nishibaru Ridge. These are the first big ridges that the Americans start to figure out, hey, actually, this is not going to be a cakewalk. My sleepless nights were not for nothing, because now things are going to get extremely difficult. And that happens quite quickly. On the other hand, as the fighting advances in that first week or two, the US firepower still inflicts far, far more casualties than they take, but on an order of something like 10-1. And this is going to hold throughout the battle. But even when the US is having its toughest moments, coming up against these fortified lines, coming up against ridges where you have like a narrow ravine going up to it, where you're really in trouble then if the enemy can concentrate fire on you and you have nowhere to get away from it. Even so, the US is inflicting casualties at the rate of about 10-1. Now, winning the casualty ratio competition doesn't mean you're always going to win the battle. The Soviet Union took far more casualties than Germany and obviously won a crushing and complete and total victory over them. But you'd much rather be on the side suffering 1 casualty for every 10 of the enemy, and you're much more likely to achieve your tactical goal, at least in that context.
That is very, very true. And of course, it's all linked to the way the US Army fights in World War II, the way the US Army has always fought. And that is, and we've said it now a number of times, it's based on firepower. That's basically what it boils down to. You have lots of accounts. If we can move to Europe for 1 second, for example, in the Normandy campaign, you've got an after-action report from the Germans fighting there against the British and also the Americans. They say, well, these Anglo-Americans, they're all soft, they're no proper soldiers because the moment we engage them, they run away and then they just bring down artillery fire on us. That's not cricket. That's not on. And I think, well, of course they do that because they're not stupid. So you might say, well, charging against the enemy's position with your bayonet, it's very heroic. It's also very stupid because you'll be very dead very soon. So it's actually a much cleverer way of fighting, but that means that the casualties are lower. It's also interesting, and we can look at the proper casualties later on, probably towards the end of this podcast or this mini-series on Okinawa. But when you look at the breakdown of US casualties, you got a relatively high proportion as well amongst the Navy contingent, the Navy personnel, just because of the Japanese kamikaze attack. So it's really interesting once you start looking at this and breaking this one down. But of course, as we now said a number of times, it's not a walk in the park. It's not a walk through the nice rainforest, because you have to fight your way through. You have to engage with the Japanese forces here. And when you look at the fighting, let's concentrate on the northern sector for another minute or so. It gets nasty the further north you go, because what you're doing now is you're pushing into the Japanese defensive position. You've also now cut off the Japanese force, and they know that they're cut off. So they're isolated. So they're basically, because that's what the Japanese do, most of them, they will fight to the death. And that, of course, means that, well, there is heavy fighting. Other nations would have used perhaps the Golden Bridge opportunity if you'd given them one, so you can get out, you can surrender, you can not really run away because it's an island, but do something. That is not really an option here. And so it takes a number of days until the 13th of April, until the 2nd Battalion of the 22nd Marine Regiment reaches a place called Hedo Point. That's the northernmost point or tip of this particular island. And so as a consequence of that, the Japanese forces called Udo Force were now cornered in this area around the Motubu Peninsula. I mentioned them earlier. The terrain here, we said a number of times, is difficult. It's mountainous, it's wooded. The Japanese are concentrating their defense very much on the Mount Yedake, which basically rocky ridges, it's ravines, so it's defender stream, it's karst area as well. So you've got a lot of loose stones, which makes it difficult for indirect fire support, because if you get too close to the indirect fire, you will have all these splinters springing off, and that makes it very, very difficult. And you have some very heavy fighting. It's the Marines who are mainly fighting their way through, and they clear this area eventually by the 18th of April. So it takes a number of days to fight your way through. The interesting thing is, you might say, okay, this is all secure now. The area is now cleared. The fight in the northern part of Okinawa is over. Well, far from it, because what you get now on the 24th of May, in an interesting little episode, the Japanese were basically airlifted in a number of, you might call them Japanese commandos. And they get airlifted in, and they attack Yomitan, where they blow up, basically, it's petrol, and in the airfield, and it's somewhere in the region of 250,000 liters of fuel are blown up by them. As a consequence of that particular engagement, they're all killed, and the defenders lose, I think it's 2 defenders, if I'm not mistaken. So again, if you go pure body count, the Americans, if that's the right word, win, but you lose 250,000 liters of petrol. Interesting episode. So airlifting people in, using commandos. You know it's a suicide mission, but they are doing it. At the same time, while this is going on, there are also some other actions in the area just off the mainland. So there's another small island that gets attacked by the Americans. There's the 77th Infantry Division, but that is what you might call the land operation list here. We're now into what people have called, can call mopping up operations. So you know the main fight is over. That one is also interesting because the Americans get attacked by kamikaze. We can talk about this a bit more when we talk about air and the Navy contingent. But this is basically it. The fighting on this particular island is over by the 21st of April. And you might say that by that stage, then, the fight in the northern part is pretty much over. So 2 phases, as the Americans wanted to have. Phase 1, land in the center, cut the island in half. Then phase 2, move towards the northern sector, simultaneously, and phase 3 then to the southern sector as well. To begin with, they think it's going extremely well. They speed things up. Then they hit the Japanese defenders, and then things get a bit nasty, and they need to fight their way through. By 24th of April, roughly speaking, the fighting in the north is now very much over, and the Japanese are now concentrating on the defense of the southern part of the island.
I just wanted to jump in quickly here with another project that we've been working on at Battle Guide, and it has to do with Okinawa as well. We've written a book together, and that means Matthias plus me plus Dan and Spencer from our sister podcast on the First World War, Not So Quiet on the Western Front. The book is called Inferno, and it's about 12 battles that shaped the 20th century from the 2 world wars. And guess what? Okinawa is one of those battles that we think shaped the 20th century, and I wrote the Okinawa chapter. So if you're interested in a deeper dive into Okinawa and why it was important in the grand scheme of history, then by all means, check out Inferno. You can do that at battleguide.co.uk/inferno. Right, and on April 12th, because we don't want to forget about politics on this podcast, right? War and politics, war is politics by other means, as the old saying goes.
Good old
political objective in order to successfully wage war. On April 12th, there's a political event, politically significant event, let's say, which is that President Roosevelt dies. And we may think to ourselves, and we're not entirely wrong, how does that change anything on Okinawa? But if you're the Japanese or the Germans, you might grasp at straws, right? So there is a very slight temporary morale boost amongst the hard-pressed Japanese, saying, oh, the enemy leader has died. Maybe this will change something about the course of the war. Probably not today or tomorrow, probably not in my cave or trench or what have you. But as the German saying goes, hope dies last, right? So you do have some statements by some Japanese who've left records, mostly officers, saying, oh yeah, Roosevelt's dead. Hopefully this will change something about the course that the war is clearly taking. Some Germans thought that way too, by the way, just as a mini tangent here. I think it was Goebbels who made a big deal about Roosevelt dying, saying the most important of the big 3 criminals who are fighting against us has now died, and this is a sign that the tide will turn, etc., etc. He says this as Berlin is being pounded into rubble by the Red Army. So yeah, obviously he didn't turn out to have an accurate political read. Nonetheless, I always think it's interesting how all sorts of people who are otherwise, I'm not saying Goebbels is reasonable. I'm talking now about other army officers or other civilians in general, will grasp at straws for a kind of a black swan event, even when those are very, very few and far between in history.
Well, of course, this is the perfect opportunity to get my favorite person in history, Frederick the Great, which, of course, well, that's a complete tangent, talking about Japan and America in 1945. And suddenly, boom, here he is, Frederick the Great. Just continue on with your tangent, because it's in my head. I have to get it off my chest now. So this, the death of Roosevelt, of course, we talked about the Germans. I mean, it doesn't really belong to what we're talking about now, but just to follow with that thought. Of course, there is a link to history, and at least in Germany they understood that, probably a bit less in Japan. And of course, the link is back to Frederick the Great, the 7 Years' War, when Prussia is about to get defeated, overrun, and crushed by the enemies. And then the Russian Tsarina dies. The new Tsar comes in, Peter, he's a great fan of Frederick the Great, and the first thing he does is make peace with Prussia. So that is the idea as to why they think that this is really a game changer. And you can see that in Germany. And of course, as you say, well, clutching straws and all this, probably also something that Japanese were thinking about. The question, as you said, really is that relevant for the people sitting in their caves and dugouts? Not quite sure. Would you actually be told this information? Do you have other things to do? But in the bigger scheme, when you go back to Japanese mainland proper, you go to Tokyo and all these things, that of course was something that they were thinking, oh, okay, things have changed. Maybe we can do something different now. Maybe we're going to come out, perhaps not victorious out of this entire war, but at least some sort of stalemate, status quo ante, whatever. And that, of course, means the harder you fight out there in Okinawa, the better the chances are that you might get what you want. And another reason as to why they keep fighting.
All right. So essentially, by the latter part of April, the Americans have pretty much secured the northern part of the island. It's the southern part of the island that's going to be responsible for most of the 82-day length of the campaign. It's going to be a very, very difficult nut to crack. But while this initial stage of the fighting on the island is going on, there's stuff happening at sea. And we don't want to, even though Matthias and I are probably more comfortable talking about land-based military history than naval military history. Of course, this is a Pacific. We can't and will not ignore what's happening at sea. I mentioned very early on in this mini-series about Okinawa that a bit of a fantastical part, but nonetheless a part of Japanese thinking about the battle on the island is that while the army holds out in those caves and forests, the Navy would somehow magically, with the resources it still had, come and hit the US fleet extremely hard and turn the tide, or go out in a blaze of honor, or what have you. Well, it's more the blaze of honor, I think, is how we can conceive of how the naval side of things goes. Already in early April, the Japanese start with mass kamikaze attacks. That's essentially what it comes down to. Plus the final voyage of the Yamato, the biggest battleship in the world at the time, 18-inch guns, unheard of size of a battleship, but it meets its end off of Okinawa. So, Matthias, where do we want to go first? What have you got for us on the kamikazes, let's say?
Well, maybe we start with the naval bit first, because, well, that's actually why you use these kamikazes, don't you? Because you want to destroy all these ships that are coming your way. And as we know, and as we've already discussed, well, the Japanese Navy is no longer in any state to put up some proper fight and opposition. We'll talk about the Yamato later on. And if we just look at the sheer numbers that you find here, again, they're completely mind-boggling, really, when you look at the amount of material that the Allies, in particular, of course, the Americans have here. So the U.S. Navy Task Force, called Task Force 58, deployed to the east of Okinawa. Look at a picket group of 6 to 8 destroyers and has up to 13 carriers, so 7 fleet carriers and 6 light carriers, on duty from late March 1945 to the 27th, roughly speaking, of April. And then a smaller number of ships after that. So that is an awful lot. So you also have a minimum of 14, sometimes up to 18 escort carriers in the area. In addition to that, of course, you also have a British task force, that's Task Force 57. And they've got 4 large 6 escort carriers. So they're a bit off to the Sakishima Islands to protect the southern flank. That is a lot of shipping that is sent there. And of course, a lot of shipping, that's a lot of firepower. And that's also a lot of air power, because you've got all these carriers, and that in itself makes the whole thing really, really interesting. And everyone kind of expects that something is going to happen, because they say, what are the Japanese going to do here? And everyone is, in the early stage, the first few days, actually, you might say, again, perhaps relieved is the right word, or perhaps also confused as to why nothing is really happening. And why are the Japanese not counterattacking? Are they running out of planes? Are they running out of ships? They know they're running out of ships. What about planes? The intelligence is a bit faulty. So there's one intelligence report in America which states that in one airbase, the Japanese have about 80 or 89 planes. In reality, they've got about 400. And it's roughly speaking 400 planes that now hit the fleet for the first time really on the 6th of April. And basically mass kamikaze attacks really dropping down onto the American fleet, really trying to, of course, destroy all these ships. Now, the kamikaze itself, I mean, we probably need to do an entire episode on this. The whole thing itself is very interesting. So it's divine wind, isn't it? Goes back in, that's the term, goes back in Japanese history where there was an invasion fleet that was then destroyed by a divine wind. So don't need to go into detail.
The Mongols, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And say, why do you have these guys? I mean, that in itself is quite interesting. And it's a little bit similar to what you again find in Germany in 1945. So you're basically running out of everything. These pilots are no longer really well trained. You still have a number of planes. You don't have enough petrol to fly them. So why not turn these things into flying bombs? And that is the idea. I mean, to the Western mind today, very difficult to understand. To the, for better phrase, perhaps the martial mind of the Japanese at that particular time, it did make perfect sense. But it's a concept that we in the West find very, very difficult to understand, of course. How do the Americans counteract it? Well, it's by air power, of course, but mainly it's by firing at these kamikaze planes as they're trying to drop onto the American ships. There are different approach in the Japanese. Do you actually hit the ship right on the top, particularly for carriers, because the top is not particularly well protected, or do you try to hit them from the side? So all sorts of different ideas, different ways of doing it. In the end, let's face it, while most of these kamikaze attacks are not overly successful, most of them actually get shot down. Nevertheless, you have more attacks during April. The numbers, again, are a bit debated, but some sources suggest that the Japanese lose around 1,000 to 1,100 aircraft during these kamikaze attacks, trying to drop them onto American ships during the battle for Okinawa. So that's a lot if you think about it. And when you look at the casualties on the Allied side, so you have 20 American ships that are sunk, and you've got 157 damaged. The, in inverted commas, good thing for the Americans is that most of these ships are smaller vessels. They don't really manage to sink an aircraft carrier or something like this. So because they are most protected as well by American firepower. So yes, 26 smaller ships for, let's say, 1,100 fighter planes. And of course, that means 1,100 Japanese lives. That does not look like a particularly good deal for the Japanese. And you can see the Japanese are really getting desperate because they know they need to throw something at the situation, because if they don't, they're probably going to lose this simply because of the naval and maritime power that the Allies can bring to the party here. And that, of course, then brings in this desperate attempt and this last-ditch stand, you might say, on the Japanese, which, of course, includes a very, very famous battleship.
Yeah, absolutely. I've even read some estimates of the number of kamikazes that attacked throughout the whole campaign, going up to 1,800 even. So it's quite, and the same for the ships. I guess it kind of depends, when's your cutoff date for an Okinawa related, but I've read up to 225 damaged, for example, and nearly 10,000 US casualties as a result of that, which would represent the highest losses in a sort of cohesive battle or a campaign for the US Navy since Pearl Harbor. So that's quite significant in a way. And many of the accounts that I've read anyway talk about how difficult it was because the kamikazes used a kind of a swarming tactic. So 1,100 or 1,800, that's a big number, but there are almost 1,500 Allied ships in the sea around Okinawa. But it's not one plane at one time against one ship, right? It could be 5 planes attacking one ship at once. It could be 10 planes attacking a ship at once. I read an account or an excerpt of an account of an American sailor who was manning one of the guns on one of the ships. And he's like, if we had a single kamikaze, we were pretty confident. You were not relaxed, but we're pretty confident we could bring it down. But when they came at us with 10, you know, you just don't have the time to focus the fire to be able to get them all down. And then you're sort of, you're doing your best, but you're bracing for impact at the same time. So the swarming is one of the things that helped the Kamikazes achieve the limited success, let's call it that way, that they did in inflicting the damage that they did. I think another element, you mentioned the Japanese sort of calculation, right? We don't have a lot of experienced pilots, but we have still a fair number of airframes. So if you look at it from a cold, hard, I don't know, utilitarian perspective, those lives lost are not as valuable to you purely militarily as a well-trained pilot. And by this stage of the war, even the few remaining well-trained Japanese pilots are being lost quite frequently because they're going into unequal fights. So essentially, you're going to lose the people either way. You may as well, from the cold calculating point of view, make the best use of the explosives and airframes that you have to try to damage the enemy navy. And on the topic of navies, as we say, the Japanese won not what it used to be by April 1945, but they still have their most famous ship, I guess you could probably say, certainly their biggest, the Yamato. And in keeping with the Japanese philosophy, they decide to send it on a sort of desperation, one-way final operation to help the defenders of Okinawa. The idea, look, you can assess maybe this a little bit with a different eye than me, Matthias, because you're a military person and I'm a civilian. But for me, the idea of I'm going to take an absolutely giant battleship, basically sail it alone for X days to get to an island, to beach itself on the island, to then use its guns to fight from a stationary position. I mean, if that's the best you can come up with, you're pretty desperate, or we're, as in Intel speak and Intel history, we've got two different realities going on and we're not making the same kind of rational calculations at all. Because if you have a giant battleship, no matter how big and how many guns, and it's beached on an island, I'm pretty sure that if the enemy has a vastly superior air force, that ship's not going to be able to do much before it's just a giant hulk of burnt steel, basically. But I don't know, am I missing something? Should we be given a bit more credit to the Japanese planners here, or what's the deal?
I think it's a very desperate thing that's going on here, for all the reasons that you just said. And even if you do manage to get to the island, as I said, the idea was to drive that ship to the island, to basically run it ashore and then use the big guns that this battleship has as artillery support. I mean, how realistic is this when you know that the Americans have got all the air and also naval power? So even if you do manage to get there, to place it where you want it to be, this ship is going to get completely destroyed and shot up very, very quickly, either from the air or from the enemy ships. So all that realistically does not make an awful lot of sense. The idea, of course, was also that you would use the sailors then as naval infantry. They would support the fight on the ground. This is not going to decide a battle. All you're going to do is basically you're sacrificing that particular battleship, the big battleship. And I think this is in many ways the most important aspect. Again, a bit difficult to understand, but it's a question of honor. So you've got the Navy here. The Army is doing the fighting. The Navy has basically been defeated. You might argue, if you wanted to, if that's the idea in the Japanese mind, it's the Navy that lost the war. And you can see that it's not going well. You look at the sea battles that the Japanese military loses. The land battles are actually, in inverted commas, going okay. Even at that stage, you still got troops in mainland China and all these things. So it is to restore the honor of the Japanese Navy. And this is why you go out there and sacrifice yourself. Again, there's an interesting link to what happened in Europe, end of the First World War. This idea that the German High Sea Fleet would go out and in a last-ditch battle would basically get completely destroyed in order to restore its honor. The German sailors are, what's the right word? Different, more sensible. I'm not quite sure what the word is. And they mutiny rather than saying, yep, that's a great idea. We'll do that. That is different in the Japanese case. But you can see it's a very desperate measure. It's more about glory, honor, and all these things than having a real military effect, I would say.
Yeah, and in the end, they don't even get to do that.
Absolutely.
Because, as perhaps some of you listeners and viewers already know, if you're interested in the Pacific theater of the Second World War, the US air power gets to it before the Yamato can even reach Okinawa and fire a shot in anger from a beached position in Okinawa. They sink it en route, and those 3,000 sailors who would have provided probably fairly useless naval infantry on the island and probably been killed there. Instead, they end up dying as the ship goes down. So I don't know if maybe that's honorable to the Japanese military mind in 1945. I guess to my mind today, it's not necessarily the most honorable way to go, but I exist in a different reality than they do. There's a certain, that's certainly a factor there.
That is a difficult one, isn't it? As I said now a number of times, trying to understand this thinking is difficult. But again, you don't have to go to Japan. You did find these things in Europe as well. I mean, just this, again, I'm putting on my German hat now, which is not what we're talking about, but the concept is the same. So this whole idea that when a German general surrenders, for example, he is basically expected to shoot himself because this is what you do. You're not supposed to survive because you let so many people into their deaths, so you're going to shoot yourself. That goes without saying. So it's a very different understanding of things like personal honor and all these matters, which for Western societies of today is very difficult to understand. But simple words like, I don't know, you are nothing, your people is everything. German example, Germany must live even if we die. These were common phrases, standard slogans at that time. Very different, very, very different, and very difficult to understand. And I think also in those days, that's where you see the different cultures being played out. American, Western culture against this Japanese. I think probably even the Americans were quite confused as to what was happening there.
Right. Well, hopefully, listeners and viewers, you are not confused at this stage in our minutes. You see how I connected those two?
Very good.
Creative. In our mini series about the Okinawa campaign, we've now, I think it's fair to say, probably come to the conclusion of our second episode on the campaign. The first episode sort of set the stage, the planning, why is Okinawa important, what forces do each side have, what do they want to achieve. And today we went through the landings, which were not that opposed. That's the Japanese plan, right? And then the stiffening of Japanese resistance, but the US nonetheless, by the end of April, successful in the north. And then we covered a bit of the air and sea aspect where you have the Japanese trying to compensate for their naval weakness by using kamikazes, mostly unsuccessfully, other than some tactical successes. And then this dramatic, let's put it that way, I think we all see that the same way, dramatic final voyage of the Yamato, which is not able to have any impact on the fighting in Okinawa because it gets sunk before it arrives. That leaves us, folks, for our next episode to deal with the toughest part of the battle in the south, with all the names of these famous ridges that you might have heard of before and all that comes along with that. But we will get to that in the next episode. So if you liked what you saw and heard in today's episode, by all means, we invite you to become a supporter of the podcast. You can do that at bothsidesofthewire.com. There we have exclusive material that's not available publicly in our war room. You can get a free trial by using the code Deep Dark Woods. So we hope to see you there. Otherwise, of course, we will see you in the next episode. You've been listening to World War II, Both Sides of the Wire, a Battle Guide production. To support the creation of future episodes, consider joining our dedicated supporter community, where you can enjoy exclusive benefits and connect with like-minded individuals. For more information, please see the show notes, and if you appreciated this episode, please leave a review on your chosen podcast platform. Thank you for listening. That was a very tangenty episode, I will say.
Yeah,
I
but it's
will say
good. We,
that.
we haven't had lots of tangents.
I like it. I like it.
Exactly. And people like it too. At least that's what the comments tell us. So why not?